Welcome everyone to the final episode of the Access for Who podcast. It's Molemo here and joined by Chao, and we are at the final point of our kind of exploration into this question of digital restitution. We have, over the past couple of episodes, really tried to track a kind of exploration of the nature of the digital within the African context and in relation to African memory, African heritage, and the question of restitution. And we have spoken to a lot of really great people who are doing exciting work to try and work through some of these questions, including testing out strategies for thinking through digital restitution at a practical level in terms of working with communities, but also in terms of thinking through questions of rights and ownership at all its different levels. And we've also done a bit of a whirlwind tour of kind of museum practice and museum collections and digitization of collections as well. And so today, as the kind of final session, we're looking forward, we're looking to the future and thinking about what might be the kind of infrastructures of our African data futures. And the idea is really to think through the forms and frameworks that are available to us to move forward in this way. And in a sense, we've already covered some of these topics already in our conversations with Gola, with Neema, some of the kind of imagining that's already happening by a lot of other practitioners, such as the Women's History Museum in Zambia. But today, we want to sort of buckle down and kind of try and think through how we might learn from all these different projects to create a framework that could really work for the future.
Absolutely. Thank you, Molemo. It's so interesting because we have covered a lot, just hearing you speak. And I myself, despite being there through all the episodes, I'm like, wow, that is a lot of data and that's a lot of themes that we've covered. But it's been a really amazing journey. And as you've said, in this episode, we're looking at African data futures and the infrastructures that frame the work that we're doing now, but also that will continue to frame the work that we're producing. So we're generating all this data. We are, digitizing, we're putting collections online, and at the same time, all these activities exist within certain frameworks, certain standards, and these frameworks, in essence, really determine how this data is used, as we saw in the copyright and in the legal framework episode, that we are still working in systems that govern data production, knowledge production. And so this episode is not so much about museum practice specifically, but rather practices around data and data production as a whole. Data is not created in a vacuum. When we talk about infrastructure, we're not just talking about server equipment. We are talking about people. We are talking about, either artifacts. We're talking about the different ways in which all these components that come together to bring this data to life interact with each other. And for data to have meaning at the core of it, it has to be related to people in one way or another. For you and I, Molemo, we have gone through very many variations of this, even as we are collecting data on African restitution in a way, still making sure, or we keep bringing ourselves back to the point of, well, but who is involved in restitution? Who are the parties who are engaging in this discussion? And it really speaks to that kind of people/make data intersection, We start off with Angela Okune, who is a scholar and a researcher who specializes in data infrastructure.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I am in the final days of finishing up my PhD. I'm in the Department of Anthropology at the University of California, Irvine. So infrastructures, right, are kind of I think a general understanding is the systems that kind of enable the circulation of whether it's goods or knowledge or meaning, people, power. I think it really is the kind of basis of movement for all of these things. And here again, I'm drawing on kind of the social studies of science and technology to really think about infrastructure, not just as, most people think of bridges, most people think of these kind of big infrastructure projects that we're so used to. But I also add a layer of the social to understand infrastructure as something that requires the people in practice as well, right? So it's shaped by the people as well as shaping people.
So Angela speaks to this idea of adding a layer of the social to understand infrastructure and to better understand data. This reminds us of Neema Iyer's work. You remember her from episode 1. And today she shares the practical ways in which the connections between data and people, between people understanding and remembering and visualizing data are being implemented in Uganda.
For us, I thought it was very interesting to try to think and present data in a different way than, because if you just walked up to someone on the street and showed them some chart, indicating, something is going up, something is going down, I think a lot of people would struggle to really interpret what you're telling them. And for me, it was really important to make it accessible. That is really what guides all my work, is making information accessible. Because I understand how jargony tech can be. So if you went into a community and you started talking about algorithmic bias and surveillance and digital identity and encryption, like all these words, they're so big, they're so, what does it actually mean? So one thing that I'm interested in researching right now is this concept. It's quite new to me as well, but it's a concept of data stewardship or data trusts or data collaboratives or data commons. So it's thinking about different ways in which we bring our data together and in which we benefit from that data. And I'm very curious of thinking, what does that look like in the African continent? So for example, if there's several organizations working on digital restitution and everyone has some kind of data, then how would you pool all that different data in one place? How would you decide how you govern that data? How would you decide how you share it? How people can donate to it? How you can get profits from it? So I think it's an interesting concept, and it's something that I'm very interested in looking at and trying to see what are different African values that could also support this kind of a model. But also, even thinking about African values, values are not set in stone, right? So it can also be how do we decide what our values will be as well? So I think it's a very interesting space and something that needs a lot more thought and work, and working with very different stakeholders to kind of imagine what that could look like.
In a previous episode, we touched on this question of ownership of data as it relates to IP, and particularly sort of discussed with Notando these questions of indigenous knowledge systems and cultural strategies for thinking through ideas of IP. And Neema brings a really interesting positionality to this when talking about data stewardship and kind of collective ownership of forms of data and a responsibility towards how that data is governed and shared, which is really exciting to hear from her, and I think really speaks to how we might start to use strategies from our own context, as we kind of first intimated in the first episode, to begin to think about other ways of dealing with digital restitution and digital data in relation to restitution in the first instance, but of course I think really points to other contexts as well.
I remember when we were talking about the kind of ways in which the digital is magic, in that it exists everywhere and nowhere at all. But this speaks really to what Neema is saying around ownership and a responsibility for caring towards data. Really brings us closer to an understanding of what it meant to have indigenous knowledge systems, to transfer them into digital spaces, and this is something, as you said, Molemo Notando brings up in the previous episode. And these questions around data ownership, data stewardship are not just questions that we are talking about in an abstract form. In a museum setting, they apply in various ways. Where is the data being stored? Who owns it? Who owns the actual infrastructure of the data that we are saying, for example, is Kenya's heritage or South Africa's heritage or Namibia's heritage. At the end of the day, we own it conceptually, but it exists, within someone's framework or certain servers or certain organizations. And with the entry of companies like Google and Amazon and SIAC into the cultural heritage space, it really brings up an interesting dilemma and discussion around ownership from the perspective of who is the custodian of the data. So while we might all indulge and say this is Namibia's heritage online, who is actually taking care of it at the end of the day, Angela speaks to this very brilliantly because this is a discussion that we have had with her in the past.
I found in a news article that quoted the Kenyan president, Uhuru Kenyatta. This was in October 2020. And it quoted him as saying, if you let me quote it, "We must look for a common vision in the dreams of our ancestors. We must seek out their wisdom and preserve their memory. We must bring them to life in a way that present generations can relate through technology. You can begin that journey by visiting the National Museums of Kenya page on the Google Arts and Culture platform to learn the stories of our folk and cultural heroes, relive their experiences, draw the inspiration you need from them in order to play your part in constructing and exemplifying our national ethos." And so I found this quote so striking because what does it mean when Kenyan youth are advised by their president to turn to Google for the dreams of their ancestors? And so it really has stuck with me that, I have no problem at all with Kenyans being advised to turn to their ancestors. Of course, it must be that way. But to then go through an intermediary that is Google, which is known to have extractive data for profit as part of its business model, it really just, has left me at odds.
It's important to reflect on the ways in which this isn't just a conceptual ownership of data. It's a physical one as well. And we often don't really think about the physical nature of how data lives in the real world. Like where does it actually reside and what are the power dynamics that come from the physical manifestations of data? Temi Odumosu, who's an academic art historian who we've heard from many times already in this podcast, as well as Minne Atairu, who's an artist really exploring a lot of these kinds of themes, reflect on this from a museum data and restitution data perspective, also thinking particularly about the African continent.
We also have to think about, okay, so the digital is a space of potential, but of course, who owns the servers? There's an enclosure around the digital that is invisible, but it's there. And it's right back center in the colonial framework. So unless we're going to sit and start thinking on a deep level about, owning our own or thinking about satellites and server farms and where things are going in a different kind of way. And even, I know that there's a lot of activist talk about the potentialities of, Bitcoin and all of these crypto contexts. Well, yes, but in a way that's also mapping a neoliberal capitalist logic, just offering different potentialities. So given that we know that we live within constraints and structures, within enclosures, whether they're big enclosures that we cannot feel the edges of or small enclosures, okay, how can we still think anew in those contexts? I think this is where the creativity comes. And it's the creativity that you can think of in relation to how do diasporas thrive out of a cultural context, left of community, detached from language, unable to have a fully formed sense of an identity that's rooted in one place but has a plurality of identities. Well, how have we historically thrived, right? And how can we create thriving spaces of potential within the context of what we know are kind of wider machinations of power, right?
I mean, I do think that in relation to digital restitution, as we've been talking about, there is a need to just engage with, institutions or Western institutions, knowing that the idea of digital colonialism is very real. And I like the term. It's something that one of my favorite artists coins, thinking about how Western institutions continue to extract and monetize resources from African communities using digital technology. So how do we pay attention to that as we think about restitution? Even in our communities, how do we ensure that what we're doing internally is not reinforcing the idea of digital colonialism, that we're not giving up our data freely to institutions who just want to continue extracting and plowing and monetizing our resources?
Throughout the series, we've really been asking questions, but in as much as we've been asking questions, I think the work that several practitioners, not to mention the Women's History Museum of Zambia, and other practitioners that we have spoken to are also giving us answers to the ways in which some of these questions can be addressed practically. And at this point, we'll hear from other speakers, from Angela, from Temi and Andrea as well, around what are the kind of models of data stewardship, of custodianship that we could learn from, that we could borrow from, in a bid to really make this a holistic but also a human-centered approach, an Africa-centered approach to digital data and data futures.
Oh boy, easy question. Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't have the answer, but I do wonder if there might be something to learn from what's been going on around indigenous data sovereignty, which is a movement that, I've kind of followed from afar, but is especially strong in New Zealand and Australia and also in various parts of the US and Canada. Where various indigenous communities are thinking about, pushing back against kind of objectified regimes of objective data, as an object, without recognizing the kind of relations within which data is embedded. And so they have come up with various protocols. They have, I think, been working around how to keep the materials within community. What forms of engagement with the materials make sense? Because when you ask that, when you gave the example, I just wonder, what does it mean to even get, the information back on WhatsApp? What is that experience like? And are there other forms or genres of engagement that can be kind of, established, framed, cultivated, set up, experimented around? I don't know, whether it's a art, I feel like the Nest Collective has been doing some of this stuff in the Kenyan context, whether it's, a gallery of missing, and I know you folks have been involved in it as well. So the gallery, right, of missing artifacts. There's a beautiful exhibit from 2016, I believe, around missing data, the concept of missing data, and just an empty folder of what is missing, right? And so I don't know. I think there are various creative ways that people can tactile, in a very material way, engage with this material that might not be getting it back on WhatsApp. So I would be really interested in diving in more about people's experiences around that and what forms they would want it in, And I think it's different for different communities. I don't think there is a one size answer.
We need to start thinking about ways to even limit digital access to the people for whom it's most appropriate, or thinking about different forms of labels and licenses to communicate the appropriateness of the reuse on the front end. So there's been work by Kim Christian and Jane Anderson around local contexts, and there's another project that's called Enrich that's looking about data sovereignty. But these are asking these really important questions around how do we enable reuse according to the complexity of the material itself, rather than this idea of ownership and exclusivity and being able to commercialize. Because so often, that's not the goal of trying to make these things available. It's more about how do we educate, how do we contextualize, how do we protect the person rather than the rights holder. And it's a really important question when we're thinking about, the potential of computational processing and the digital divide. Because right now, all of that power is also held in places that have benefited from wealth transfer, from colonization. And so those sorts of technologies and the availability of them are shaping that area as well, and how we think about what's possible, with computers and technology.
Listening to Angela and Andrea, we realize that it's not so much about inventing entirely new ways of relating to data or trying to create whole new systems, whole new server farms. But rather it's about building on existing practice and finding ways to amplify and expand on the really important work that's already happening, and to find ways to ensure that more people have access to that. And Temi really touches on this.
But the objects that have moved out of an African context have become a kind of diaspora. And in becoming a diaspora, they have acquired stories, histories, experiences. They have been resignified, also by way of being put into glass vitrines in temperature-controlled spaces, which is not how they were originally envisioned or used, right? So the question of ownership is one, so on the one hand, when I think about ownership, I'm thinking about a certain kind of cultural authority that still resides with the communities from which these artifacts come from. And this cultural authority is about a worldview, like their cosmology, their worldview, their way of thinking about what it means to be human, the relationship with the more than human world, their spiritual practices, and so on. And I think it's important to maintain that sense of a cultural, I don't like the word agency so much because of the way it's used in different contexts, but this kind of a sense of cultural authority that continues to belong to the communities from which these objects come from. But then you have the objects then taking a forced migration of varying kinds. And then they become a diaspora, and then they're doing other kinds of work in the cultural domain, both in physical museum spaces, and then again when they're replicated and turned into digital form.
This point of Temi's about the ways in which these objects and material heritage within museums in the global north have taken on whole new lives is such a valuable one in thinking about African data futures and what data restitution means for a future of kind of African digital heritage in a sense. Because I think sometimes we can feel like restitution of African heritage is in a sense a call on a reversal, going backwards to some idealized pre-colonial time. But I think what Temi's pointing to is the realities of where we are now and how we need to face the histories that we have kind of inherited together, the realities of what those histories have resulted in, but also the responsibilities and also the possibilities of what now needs to be created. And by doing so, we can really start to think about, okay, restitution has this capacity to potentially create something anew for the African continent and for the ethics of our relations with other parts of the world. And we need to begin framing what that should be and what we want that to be. And the digital collections, digital restitution in particular, really call on us to think about why are we doing this? What are we trying to achieve? And what are the best models, the best infrastructures, the best strategies, the best practices for making that happen? So I think after the last couple of episodes, we've really tried to explore that together and ask questions for ourselves and for anybody listening who's interested in the same about how to do this and what are the possibilities. And while a lot of it is quite challenging, I think there are some really exciting spaces, and there are definitely people doing some really exciting work. And while we've touched on a lot of subjects, there are probably a few gaps, a few things that are still important to kind of touch on. Chao, for you, what are the kind of key things?
I mean, okay, there are many. We have talked about the idea of like a digital graveyard in which we are digitizing thousands, even hundreds of thousands of objects and artifacts and archives that just sit in servers and no one accesses them and no one knows where they are in 5 to 10 years. It's very interesting to see that we're talking about data, not just as a technical abstract concept, but as a social concept as well. And this brings about the questions on caring for data, caring for this digital data. Just important. As you would, I like the term a digital garden in itself. You know, you have to tend to it, you have to weed it, you have to water it. And so even when we create this data, from an African perspective in particular, we are saying that we are creating this data, we are planting the seeds, and we hope that these seeds, this data grows into something else, you know, that people use it for other things. And so this idea behind digital gardening really is a core point of data sustainability in the ways in which we're saying that this data that we're creating right now, we want it to be accessible 10 years from now. And so we have to put in the structures, whether it's funding structures, whether it's human resource capacity, to not just create data or digitize data, but also take care of it.
One of the things, as you mentioned now, Chao, that we haven't even really discussed is the absolute amount of energy that collections in their physical form use in sort of temperature-controlled storage rooms in museums of the North, but how that is then replicated in digital collections, and how these servers and these infrastructures that we've mentioned in and of themselves are major energy guzzlers. And all of these kinds of questions feed into this question of what is sustainable. Do we see these collections really being used in their digital form, as you've just asked, in say the next 10 years, and if so, in what way, and what really makes sense? And I think that one of the things we've really just been emphasizing over and over again, and so many of our speakers have spoken to, is that there's this current rush to digitize thousands and thousands of objects in the global North. And what we're speaking to is what is the purpose of that? In what way does this create an ecosystem? In what ways is this really usable? And in what ways is this looking to repair so much of the damage of the past, or just replicate it? In what ways is it possible to then care for this data? Or are we simply, as you say, creating more graveyards? And I think we're kind of emphasizing, hey, what could be possible if we took a little bit more time, were a little bit more careful, asked ourselves the right questions, and did this in the best possible way, in the most ethical way, and in a way that brings all of those different aspects of the ecosystem on board.
I think one of the things that we have talked about as well is that digital restitution is a monster in its own. That there's so many questions and so many things that we need to consider. But at the same time, I say this with a very firm conviction that we shouldn't be shying away from these questions. We shouldn't be shying away from seeking answers and doing the work, because if you're in a position where you feel that digital or digitization is the easy way out or is the easier route, you're probably not asking the right questions. And what we've seen through the episode is that in as much as there are questions, there are ways of really coming and creating solutions for them. Molemo, when you say that a lot of the work rests on African shoulders, it is very true. At the same time, we're saying that even digital restitution in itself is not a substitute for physical restitution. How do we make it so that digital restitution, digitization, is aiding in this work that African practitioners have to do within the restitution process? They're not separate in the sense that digital restitution is not a solution or is not something that we say, okay, since we've digitally restituted, we don't need the physical stuff anymore. What we're saying is that digital restitution is aiding the process of physical restitution and should aid in the ways in which it can allow for reconnecting to objects, it can allow for dialogue, it can allow for knowledge production, it can allow for questioning as well. And this work that we are doing as African practitioners in setting a stage for this digital work to happen as it aligns to our humanities and our context and our histories, as well as our futures, is extremely, extremely crucial.
Chao drops the mic. I think that brings us to the end of our podcast. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us on this journey of questions. This has been Access for Who, a podcast by myself, Molemo, Moiloa, and
Chao, Tayana, Maina.
Thank you very much for joining us.
For who and for what? Goodbye.
This podcast is brought to you by Open Restitution Africa, a collaboration between African Digital Heritage and Andani Africa. The podcast is produced by Chao Tayana Maina and Molemo Moiloa, with Pumzile Nomboso Twala and Letabolaka Gumede on research. Thank you to Josh Chiundiza for the music, Karugu Maina on design, and Annelien van Heembeek on editing.
The podcast was made possible by 99 Questions at the Stiftung Humboldt Forum in Berliner Schloss. This podcast is also available in zine form in French and German at www.openrestitution.africa and www.humboldtforum.org. Thank you for joining us.